Thanks for joining us today. I'm Bryan Hoban, and I am the Executive Vice President and General Manager of the Member Business Advisory Program for PECAA. That's really just a long and overly fancy way to say that I manage a team of business advisors that consult with PECAA members on finance, billing and coding, optical marketing, cold starts, and much more. I've been in this industry and with PECAA for just over 10 years now, and my wife owns a 2-location private practice here in Portland, Oregon. Tonight, we're going to be talking about getting into private practice and some of the opportunities that are available there. And please feel free to ask any questions during my presentation. If it makes sense to, I'll pause and cover them as we go. Otherwise, we'll cover anything at the end. So, as I said, do work for PECAA, no other financial interests at all. So let's start off by talking about some of the goals of what we want to make sure we accomplish today. I want to make sure that you walk away having highlighted some of the opportunities that exist in private practice. And so when I look back to when my wife was in school, just over 10 years ago now, the mantra seemed to be all about private practice, although the tools that they provided weren't always those necessary to actually thrive in private practice. But post-grad, those private practice jobs weren't necessarily plentiful. So many docs were cobbling together a schedule mixed with maybe a few days at a corporate location, a few days at a private location. And as a result, I think that the message in the schools has since shifted in recent years. And it seems to be more that there's a belief now that private practice isn't a viable option straight out of school. And so hopefully one of the takeaways here today is that it is. For the last few years in particular, even despite all of the new schools that have come online, this is absolutely not the case. We have a lot of docs out there who are either looking to sell a practice, and so there's an opportunity to come buy in. We have a lot of doctors opening up private practice cold starts, and there are numerous associate opportunities out there. So what we'll start off with is going over an overview of the current market, just to kind of give you an idea of where the industry is at, particularly in private practice. And so we'll look at how the industry has performed really since the onset of COVID. And then we'll discuss what we've seen since then and here early into 2022. It has definitely been a few very interesting years. And then we'll go through what are those opportunities that exist within private practice. And so I'm going to explore 3 main ways of getting into private practice. And so those are going to be cold start. We'll talk about how to go about getting started with cold start. We'll go over the considerations that you should really be making sure that you're comfortable with before you go down this road. And we'll touch on some of the resources that'll be available to help you along the way in that journey. After that, we'll look at purchasing a practice. And this market has changed a bit over the past few years. The advent of private equity has greatly impacted the sales of optometric practices. This has been good for some, not so good for others. We'll cover a little bit on prices. Ultimately, it really depends on the situation, the quality of the practice. But we have seen prices elevated a little bit for sure on the private equity side. They continue to increase, and that's had some carryover into the private OD to private OD market as well. And we'll talk through the process, how to get started with a practice purchase, and everything that goes into that roller coaster ride. Then finally, we'll look at the associate OD market. And as I've already alluded to, demand is high right now. We'll discuss who's hiring, what they're looking for. We'll touch on compensation, how this may play into being an associate and then moving into future buy-in options. So that is what we will be covering tonight. We're going to start with, like I said, the current market overview. So demand remains really strong right now in this industry, and I expect that to continue. We have baby boomers continue to age and will need care. Well-run practices, they're as busy as they've ever been right now. So, overall, the industry has made it through COVID really well. And as a result of COVID, what we've actually seen is people are placing an increased importance on their health since the COVID onset. This has definitely helped with compliance. It's helped with routine comprehensive exams actually being a little bit closer to that annual routine exam that they're supposed to be. But definitely seeing people place a little bit more importance on their health as a result, and that has been positive in the eye care industry. MD fields continues to, the growth within the MD field continues to not match demand. And it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. We've seen in some areas that it's opened some doors for ODs, and I wouldn't be surprised if that continues in coming years. From a financial perspective, despite all of the increased competition, insurances, managed vision care, declining reimbursements, margins are actually really still strong in this industry. There's not that many industries that offer the same margins that we see in eye care. And those owners, practices that are willing to adapt and put in the effort on the business side of the practice can really see great results. The model isn't going to be what it was 20 years ago. Those who expect it to be and practice like it is, they're struggling today. But those that embrace change and adapt their business are really doing well. And in addition to these strong margins, there's a ton of untapped potential in most practices out there. Often this is going to be through improvement of stronger management, improved efficiencies within the practice, but there are so many specialties that a practice can focus on that the grand scheme of things are still, I don't know if emerging is the right word, but are very young. So think dry eye, myopia control, sports vision. I know they're not new, but there is so much untapped opportunity there and opportunity to build a practice around those specialties. Those opportunities are just greater than they ever have been before. And there continues to be, whether it's new products, the emergence of coverage, whether it's in the news or just in the industry in general. So there's a lot of great opportunity within those specialties. And then lastly, private equity has opened a new door in terms of exit strategies for doctors. So while this isn't necessarily a selling point for a lot of you who might be listening tonight who are looking to enter private practice, it very could well be down the road. It's increasing the ease at which a well-run practice can be sold. So particularly those very large ones. And we'll touch back on that topic a few more times before we end the evening. So I don't think anything on this slide is going to be overly earth-shattering, but there are still plenty of headwinds that are facing the industry. Like I said, I've been in this industry 10 years, and every one of those, the next headwind was going to take the industry down, but yet here we are still going strong. Vertical integration will only continue. This is an old story at this point, but it continues to occur. I don't foresee any changes anytime soon, particularly as two of our largest industry giants continue to face off against each other. I promised I'd come back to it at some point, but private equity, this hits the headwind side as well. It's going to increase competition. So while there's some positives for that private practice doctor who's looking for an exit and has a great practice and can get a nice sale price, that's one less practice now in private practice. These companies are going to continue to provide competition as they grow. They're going to come in, they're going to drive efficiencies while operating closer to that traditional private practice model, but being run much more as a corporate entity. It's taken away a number of great offices as a potential purchase for young ODs down the road. And we'll continue to see traditional online competitors, such as 1-800-CONTACTS. They saw a huge growth throughout COVID. So for some of these companies, the pandemic was fantastic for them. New tech disruptors are also going to continue to enter the market. Some of these could have positive impacts if you use them effectively, but most of those are not going to come to market with your best interests in mind. And then what might be one of the most obvious, big box retail. It's here to stay. It will continue to be a competitor. And similar with declining reimbursements. Not any news there, but reimbursements are not going up anytime soon. So leading into the pandemic, this is one of the bigger changes we've seen is rising staffing costs. So this was happening heading in. We had historically low unemployment, along with rising staffing costs, the impact of benefits, insurance costs, wages were already increasing, and that has definitely continued and is a challenge for sure in the industry. And we'll come back and touch on that a little bit more later on as well. All right, so let's talk about some more specific COVID impact. Most practices actually survived COVID pretty well financially. If we look at the average practice, the majority of them, and this isn't necessarily every single one, but the majority actually saw revenues in 2020 that were in line with 2019. Many of them actually saw increases in 2020 over 2019 revenue. And then once again, heading into 2021. So 2021 was a pretty decent year for most practices. 22 has been a little bit different. It's been a fairly interesting start to the year so far. So we had what was a pretty good December of 21, not quite the crazy end of the year rush that you typically would see prior to the pandemic. But then as we got into January, Omicron was popping up. And so those first 2 to 3 weeks of January, a lot of cancellations from patients. A lot of offices had to shut down for a few days or a week or so due to staffing shortages as Omicron came through the office. They typically recovered the last week or so of January, but net, the month was kind of a flat to down. February and March were okay. There's definitely some variability for offices. So you'll talk to some that had pretty good months, others, it was slower. And then we're seeing increasing data so far showing April being fairly soft, and May so far has continued to be a little bit softer as well. So as I continue to see vendor sales reports, talking to other folks, talking to individual offices, April, May has just been a little softer than what you might have originally expected. And at this point, it's not so much a 2-year hangover from the COVID shutdown, as most offices had backfilled those months reasonably well into 2021. It does just seem to be a little bit of a slowdown here in the industry. So size mattered for offices. The larger offices were actually impacted more generally than smaller offices. Most of this was primarily due to those really large, busy offices not being able to follow distancing guidelines and stay on their previous schedules. Particularly, say, those large offices that had 4 or 5 doctors working in the same space, running 20-minute schedules. They just couldn't get those patients in at the same rate. Some of the smaller offices actually saw a nice influx of patients due to these larger offices not being able to see them or booking out too far, that patients ended up looking elsewhere. Those offices, 1 doctor, 2 doctor offices that had 30-minute exam slots or longer, they were typically the fastest ones to recover because they were able to get back to, and let's call it a quasi-normal operation, much faster than some of the larger ones. PPP funds brought a nice infusion of capital into practices, and with how quickly the patients came back once the offices were allowed to reopen in May into June, just depending on where you were, that allowed offices to bring back staff really quickly and confidently. And really set up practices to succeed throughout the summer of 2020, which for most offices actually turned out to be a pretty good period. So as patients returned, those that were venturing out into the scary world were typically those that needed care. And so as a result of that, we actually saw some nice improvements in terms of revenue. Capture rates was a great example of a change that occurred during the pandemic. So heading into the pandemic, ending in 19, capture rates were declining, falling a couple percent every year for a number of years heading into 2020. But what we saw as things reopened, they jumped decently, right? Because those who were coming in, they truly did need glasses or contacts and were more likely to purchase. What we've seen is this has receded some in 2021 and again here in 2022, but does still remain elevated from pre-pandemic levels. And like we mentioned earlier, some of those online retailers did thrive quite a bit during the pandemic. COVID did help on the private practice side, as it did prevent some of those that would typically shop around other physical retail stores. So those patients often were buying more in the office if they weren't going online. And as I touched on in the headwinds section on the last slide, staffing is currently proving to be really difficult. And this is both from a non-OD and an associate OD staffing perspective. There are a lot of offices actually right now that are limiting their patient care as a result of either not having enough non-OD staff or they're booking out and need an associate OD to improve their capacity. So it's very hard to find good employees right now, and that seems to be the case pretty much all over the country. All right, so while prior to COVID, we were seeing some divergence in terms of the offices that are thriving versus those that maybe weren't doing as well. It's definitely been exacerbated since then. There is a divergence that is happening and at a faster rate than before between those really well-run offices and those with weaker management teams. So what we're seeing is some of these really well-run offices, they continue to book out. They're struggling to meet patient demand. They're having great months. These offices are the ones who are really looking to hire associates right now, and they're struggling to do so. But then on the flip side, there's quite a few offices I'm talking to that are struggling to get patients in the door, or they've had to reduce hours because they can't retain the staff that they have. These are often offices where the doctor may have already been starting to pull out a little bit, and the office is probably starting to see some flattening to declining revenues pre-pandemic. In the cold start market, cold starts continue to be pretty strong. In the last, I'd say 5-6 years, we've seen elevated levels of new activity with cold starts, and that has definitely continued throughout the pandemic. So many docs during the shutdown use that as the catalyst to start their office, and that demand has continued even since then. Financing is very accessible. Banks continue to grow more and more comfortable lending to optometry, particularly those that were previously strong in the dental and the vet fields. They continue to look to grow more and more within the optometry vertical, and rates and structure and the ease at which you're able to get loans have continued to become easier as a result. Now, with inflation and what's going on from an economic perspective, we are seeing upward pressure on rates, but despite that, they're still pretty favorable at the moment. One of the questions that I get all the time is this the right time? And I think this same question applies to practice purchases as well. The answer really lies in weighing the positives and some of those headwinds that we discussed earlier, and then layering in your expectations for interest rates and ability to get financing down the road, and where inflation is going for the near and medium term. And then we have to take into account the elevated cost of TI work at the moment. So contractors are very expensive. Materials costs have gone up. And I wouldn't expect to see a return in either the low interest rate environment, along with those contractor material prices returning to any of the pre-inflationary levels anytime soon. So obviously, I don't have a crystal ball, but definitely you do have to weigh in your individual situation what risks are you willing to take on there. And then in the practice purchase market, there are a lot of practices that are either currently available for purchase right now, or offices that have a doc that is looking for an exit, but maybe hasn't officially listed the office. Many docs who are approaching retirement age are in a position where they maybe don't quite fit into a PE model, or they aren't quite sure about how to go about finding someone to buy their office, but they know they're ready to start that process. So we've touched a little bit on the impact of private equity and that it's been primarily purchasing larger office. Like I said, this has had some impact on pricing, but private to private sales have been elevated a little bit as a result, particularly in cases where the seller is able to leverage PE as a negotiating tactic. But if you are talking to a seller that is trying to do that, do make sure you understand how realistic an option it is for them. So for example, if a doc is not willing to work post the sale, well, PE probably isn't an option for them, because typically they're going to require that doctor to stay on for a period of a couple of years. And in that case, that should have no bearing on a private to private OD sale. One other impact of private equity is it's removing that natural sale to an associate. So we'll see owner, long-term associate, young associate looking to buy in, but the dollar signs from PE prove to be too tempting, and the doctor sells out to private equity instead. Actually, it happened to my wife, so I have some personal knowledge on that one. But what is available out there? There's still plenty of good practices, but also a number of the smaller ones, those that have kind of flatlined in revenue. Owners aren't quite as invested as they used to be, maybe haven't adapted to changing times. Often a doc who struggled through COVID, just maybe from a mental perspective in terms of managing and all of the headaches that were brought on with that, and are just really burned out as an owner. But this has allowed some good opportunity for those who are looking to get in and purchase a private practice. A lot of these offices are ripe for a quick turnaround for someone who's willing to put in an effort. I kind of think of them as a warm start, and they've got good bones, but they just need a little bit of love. And essentially you start a couple years ahead of where you would be if you were doing a true cold start. So you have a nice core patient base, and typically you're going to see return to profitability much faster than you would getting there with cold start practice. On the associate market side, I've said a few times now, but again, associates in very high demand. And this is true for both a rural and an urban location. It's and everything in between. It's everywhere. Folks are looking for associates. Typically, these offices are going to fall into one of these categories. They're booked out too far, and they absolutely need to add capacity. When I'm consulting with doctors, I'm encouraging them, if they're in a growing practice, that they should be adding doctor capacity before they're consistently booking out 1 to 2 weeks. As you get past that, you start to risk losing patients, and you furthermore risk the ability to attract new patients, because they're typically not willing to wait 2 or 3 weeks. Existing patients that have been there, going there for years, they're the ones who are typically willing to wait longer periods of time. Another would be an office that is seeing solid growth, but they have limited capacity and they want to continue growing before they hit their capacity. So think of this as the doctor who wants to grow fast. They want to be the biggest, they want to be the best. And rather than waiting till they actually get booked out, they're going to start adding capacity before they truly, truly need it. And then the third would be that doc who's looking to pull back, hand over a portion of the schedule to an associate doc. This could be to ease into retirement. This could be to spend more time working on the business end of the practice, but both provide great opportunity and a way to continue to allow the practice to at least stay steady and or grow, rather than starting to take days off and let the revenue decline start to happen. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on corporate OD pay, but private practice pay is competitive, and we're definitely seeing upward pressure on OD pay. So definitely can make a very good living as a private practice practitioner, whether as an associate or practice owner. From a work hours perspective, they're very practice dependent, a lot of both part-time and full-time positions out there. And I'll go into it a little bit more later, but definitely shouldn't be a holdback in terms of being able to find something that fits your needs. All right, so let's dive into launching a cold start, and what does it take to actually do that? So where do you start in setting up a cold start office? To me, one of the best places is really, aside from having the ideas, creating a business plan. And some bankers will require this, but even if they don't, it's really a good exercise to do. And it's one that makes you think critically about the concept that you've put together. And it forces you to have to explain to essentially yourself or whoever the reader is, what's actually going to make your practice successful. So just a really good exercise to go through, regardless of whether you need it or not. And then as part of that business plan, you should be developing some financial projections. And this, again, may be required by banks. Some do, some don't. But I think it's an absolutely critical step in getting started. I want to make sure that you can look at those projections and make sure that this is something you're really comfortable doing. So really, you should be creating a realistic set of projections and then also a worst case scenario. And I want you to be able to look at that worst case scenario and say, all right, if this happens, does my practice survive that first year? Am I set up to still succeed going into second year? And making sure that you're comfortable and you can live with those scenarios and everything in between. Part of that business plan is going to be critically assessing your goals and why are you doing this? What do you want to get out of it? What do you need from a personal financial standpoint? Are you prepared to fully manage not only patient care, but the business as well? And how you answer those questions is going to play heavily into, number one, should you do this? And then secondly, how you actually go about opening up your practice. In terms of resources that are available, there are an increasing number of consultants, Doctor Alliance groups, other groups that provide great resources for cold starts. A good banker can be very helpful here as well. Make sure you're surrounding yourself with people that know this area, lean on them for help. Many of you probably have friends and colleagues that have done this recently and are willing to help and share their experience. I know there's Facebook forums and other groups for cold start practices where you can bounce ideas off each other, as well as lots of people like myself who do this work with offices. So why should you do a cold start over some of the other options that are available? First and foremost, it's your office, all aspects of it. You get to control everything from the design, the build, the finishes, maybe even more control than you ever want. But it is a great way to make your office exactly how you want it from day one. Everything is fresh, it's new. You don't have to worry about coming into a practice with old carpet, wallpaper, failing equipment. You get to start fresh. You mentioned financing earlier. Like I said, terms are still really favorable. Although TI contractor material costs are quickly rising, already elevated, and we are starting to see that with interest rates as well. Financing is still really good, at least in terms of where it's at versus historical norms. So if it is something that you're either currently pursuing or you're seriously looking into, the sooner you can get your financing in shape, the better you're going to be. As I don't foresee, at least in the near term, interest rates coming down anytime soon there. And then lastly, you're not inheriting existing problems at all with your own cold start. You may create some new ones for yourself, but you aren't inheriting existing ones. All right, so what does it take? Once you've decided to make that leap and you have your business plan, at that point, it's probably time to start to look for financing. I would start talking with a banker early on. You can even do this really even before you've completed your business plan. I want you to understand what's available to you in terms of loan limits, structure, rates. What is your banker going to be looking for? What are they going to require out of you, so that you can make sure that you're completely ready and organized. A lot of this stuff kind of needs to be done concurrently. And so there's a few things that the more that you can have lined up and started the process early on, the better off you're going to be down the road. So in terms of the loan, I would recommend that you get set up with a 10-year term on your loan. And typically, a lot of the banks are going to have in front of those 10 years an interest-only year or term. It might be some do 14 months, some do 11 months, some do 13. It's usually right around a year of interest only. Then your loan terms out and you have a 10-year repayment after that. That's going to really help cash flow during that first year, having that interest-only period, and allow you to get to a point where you should be cash flow positive and ready to start making those loan payments in your second year. So like I said, rates still very favorable, but starting to rise. We're seeing banks also increasing their lending limits as a result of what's going on recently with the escalation of prices. So a lot of startup loans, often in the $250,000 to $350,000 range. I've seen a couple go a little bit higher, but most offices can be started with a loan in that range. So once you have that loan amount set, then you need to look at what do you need for those tenant improvement build-out costs, equipment, versus the working capital that you're going to need to ultimately operate your practice. And so early on, you'll want to make sure that you understand the build-out costs of the space, timing of when any TI allowance from the landlord will occur. So if you're not going to get reimbursed till the very end from the landlord, obviously you're going to have to float that for a period. But at the same time, you'll know then that you have that money coming back, which can be used for working capital or other equipment needs at that time. So make sure you do understand that as part of the lease, how the timing will work, and that it will set up well for how you're going to run the practice. Equipment, you might need to be strategic on. So particularly if you are going to be purchasing quite a bit of equipment, I look at things like, what do you actually need to start versus what do you want? So maybe a brand new OCT on day one might not make the most sense. Maybe it makes more sense to wait, say, closer to the end of the first year and get a new one or a used one at that time. That's one I can't make a blanket statement on. A lot of it depends on how you want to practice and your individual situation. So concurrent with that banking process, it's time to find your space. I would recommend working with a broker to assist you throughout that lease negotiation process. Brokers are currently, brokers are much like a realtor. They get paid a commission from the leasing agent, not directly out of your pocket. So they can help you throughout that process. They're on your side. Not going to cost you money, very much helps with no negotiations. Make sure that as you're looking for your location, that it's a good quality location. You understand the patient demographics, that where you're looking, what you're going to be paying matches the ethos of that practice that you're trying to build. And then I would make sure you engage your contractor and architect early on. And do this before you sign the lease. So as you're looking around, once you've narrowed it down to one or two spaces, that's a great time to have a contractor come in, give you a bid. But what will happen as they're going through and doing that bid, they're actually going to help you with your lease negotiations. So they might bring up some aspects of the space that maybe you hadn't realized, and that will give you some additional leverage as you complete those negotiations. Same thing with an architect, making sure that a functional design can be done in that space and they don't come up with any unforeseen issues. Just completed a move of one of my wife's office, and this is definitely something that I learned as a result of that. I wish we had engaged our contractor much sooner than we did. It would have definitely helped with those lease negotiations. Equipment, I alluded to this a minute ago, but making sure that your needs and the desires for equipment match up with the loan funds that are available. You'll need to decide, what do you need on day one? What needs to be new and fancy and shiny versus where might a used piece of equipment work? There's also some pieces of equipment like retinal imaging that can be really expensive, but the ROI on those is so good that even a cold start practice can make those purchases and still have positive cash flow. If you're looking at retinal imaging, for some of the main brands out there, if you're doing 10 a week, you're typically cash flow positive on that, and it can be a great addition to your practice. Some of those larger ones, they cost 60, 70, 80 grand. That might be one, though, that you want to finance that outside of your bank loan to make sure you have enough capital for some of those other needs. And then making sure that you have sufficient lead time as you're going about ordering your equipment, as we are seeing more and more delays right now with delivering. Marketing is absolutely critical. I've seen a lot of practices try to save money by not spending on marketing, and they almost always are going to grow significantly slower than those that do. Sometimes so slow that they work themselves into a cash flow problem because they run out of working capital and are unable to cover the rent and those other fixed payments that they have. 10 to 20 grand is, I think, a reasonable budget for your first year, but much more important than actually having that set number is having a really sound plan on how you're going to spend that money. So how you spend it is much more than the actual dollar amount of what you spent. So what happens? You go through and you take the plunge, you open your practice, what to expect. Again, varies wildly, but a decent cold start office often is going to do around 200 to 250,000 in collections in their first year. I've seen this number go anywhere from 100,000 to well over 500,000, but most of them are going to be closer to that low 200s number. So let's keep that in mind as you're going through and you're doing your projections. Is what does it look like around that number? What does it look like if we kill it and do 400,000? But what does it look like if it grows really slow and we only do 150? Early growth is really critical for cold starts. EHR, utilities, rent, many of the other expenses, they're going to be pretty stable regardless of how much revenue you do that first year. So the faster you grow, the quicker you're going to be able to achieve profitability. So making sure you set yourself up that you can grow quickly is very important. Ultimately, what you're going to be able to take home for yourself is going to greatly depend on your goals for the practice. In a perfect world, you're not going to take much the first year and use most of that cash to help grow your office. But part of the creation of your projection is ability to look through that and make sure that you understand what you need personally versus what the practice is going to need. Practices should probably start showing positive cash flow in the middle of their first year and more consistent profitability and cash flow during the end of that first year. Really, renting and staffing levels are going to be the biggest determinants of that. And again, that can vary dramatically just depending on how you set up your practice. So speaking of staffing levels, I get the question a lot: who should I hire? How many? What positions? I think you need to be thinking about who that first employee is, who that second one is. How does that match up with your strengths and weaknesses? So if you love optical, maybe an optician isn't your first hire. Maybe it's someone more in an admin type role, maybe someone who can help out with teching. But if you have no optical experience, well, then an optician is going to make much more sense. Most offices are going to start with 1.5 staff members. And if you do just start with one, I'd be prepared to add that second, probably part-time person fairly quickly. You don't have to have the world's best optician or office manager to start your practice. Trust me, you're going to have plenty of opportunities to hire that person over your career, and it doesn't need to be on day one. Aside from early family and friends, you might only be seeing a patient or two a day early on. And so I will argue that a highly skilled optician that you're paying the mid-20s per hour might not be the best use of funds if they only had the opportunity to sell one pair of frame a day. The other thing to consider would be moonlighting versus being in your private practice. And this is a bit of a conundrum and something you'll have to think through. And a lot of it's going to depend on what your personal goals are. 3 days a week is pretty common for a new practice. I've seen docs do anywhere though from 2 days to full time starting out. Some banks might actually require you to have some level of moonlighting income. So again, something to check for early on as you talk to your bankers. Ultimately, really, I want the number of days that you're going to work in the office to match up with your personal income needs versus your goals of growing the practice. So if you want to be the biggest, fastest growing office in your area, well, then you better start with more days available in your office. If you want to be available whenever a patient comes in to be seen, that's how you're going to grow faster. If you're more concerned about measured growth, maximizing your earnings potential, then you're going to want to work at the office fewer days, but your office will not grow quite as quickly as it would. All right, so let's cover some pitfalls that I do see with cold starts. Loan structure is one of the ones that I've seen put a lot of practices in a bad spot. It's either not allowing for enough funds, or they end up getting constrained by working capital, not allowing enough to be spent on marketing. Having a 5-year or 7-year term is one that I've seen, and that leaves loan payments that become unmanageable. This is going to be one of the easiest times in your business career to get money. The day you open up your doors until the day that you exhibit at least a full year of profitability and cash flow generation, that will be the hardest time to get money. So if you get into a cash flow crunch in that first or second year, it's going to be really difficult, if not impossible, to get financing help. And then playing off that last comment, offices that try to go too cheap early on in an effort to reduce loan size, they don't end up with the office that they want. This could be something like having a higher end demographic, but an office that just doesn't match that aesthetically, and that can hamper revenue growth as well. I've already mentioned lack of marketing. Please make sure you spend money on the marketing and get your practice name out there. All these mistakes that lead to slow revenue growth just mean that it's that much longer before you start covering those big expenses like rent, staff, and other large costs at the level that you should. And like I said earlier, it leads to a lack of cash flow and just makes it even more difficult then to spend that money once you realize that you need to. Lastly, building size is an important consideration. You probably don't need a 5-lane, 4,000 square foot office right away. Probably not going to be the best financial decision. Typically, we're seeing 1,200 to 1,800 square foot locations for the average cold start. As you go through over time, like I said, 2 to 250 in revenue that first year, pretty common. Second year, anywhere in the let's call it 200 to 350 range. Year 3, 300 to 500,000. But again, those are just ranges, and I've seen lots of practices grow even faster, plenty grow even slower, but definitely possible to grow into a pretty nice size practice within your first 3 to 5 years of practice. Your take-home pay, that's a really hard one to give broad expectations on. Revenue growth is a key driver here, as are staffing levels, general overhead, rent. Those play a huge factor. So if practice growth is the most important thing to do, your take home is going to end up lower because you're going to have to continue to reinvest back into the practice. You're going to have to hire staff sooner than you truly need them. Whereas if you really just care about profitability, you can run a really efficient practice in the 300,000 to 400,000 range and take home a very nice salary. So a lot of it just really depends on your personal goals and where those financial projections are really important to make sure that how you're setting up your practice makes sense. All right. Let's move on to purchasing a practice, and we'll walk through a little bit of where to start, how to go about it in that process. Brokers, plenty of brokers out there. Doctor Alliance groups might have plenty of offices, know the people that are looking to sell. There's other practice listing sites, OD forums, state associations, school listings, talking to your peers. Vendors can be a great one here. They're well connected and know who's looking to sell. We're not always often seeing practices do a great job of listing practices. So there's plenty out there that are thinking about it. They just don't know how to go about it and might not have their practice listed. So you might have to do a little asking around if that's something you're really looking into. As you go into the negotiations, I think it's really important to understand the seller's mindset. Is this something that they need to do, or are they entertaining the conversation just because you're interested? Do they have the option to sell the PE? Are they more concerned about their patients and staff or maximizing the purchase price? Similarly, understanding each other's goals. Is that seller ready to be done practicing and they just want to turn over the keys, or are they looking to remove the business, the staff management duties, and just focus on patient care? If you can both understand where each other are at, that negotiation process is going to be significantly smoother. The process overall, it will be a roller coaster. There's a lot of up and downs throughout a practice purchase, but the more you understand each other, the smoother that's going to be. Valuation is a key component and very important on both sides. So typically a practice seller thinks their practice is worth more than it really is, particularly those that aren't run overly efficiently. There's an emotional component as their life's work is now distilled down just to one number, and that might be lower than they were expecting. But a well-done practice valuation should be based off of the cash flow value of the practice, and if done correctly, is going to allow you to have a positive ROI if and when you do make that purchase. I want you to make sure you assess practice needs as you go into this. So a good valuation will capture some of this, but do want to make sure that you can run the practice the way you want. So we need to make sure that we're looking at the building. We want to make sure that that's going to work for you. Is the current location all right? Will you need to move? Will you need to remodel? Same with equipment. Do you need any equipment needs in the near future? If it's in the extreme near future, that should be captured in the valuation. But again, there's a difference between a serviceable piece of equipment and what you may or may not want in your practice. Staffing needs are also important. You want to make sure you assess that current staff, make sure that it matches how you plan on operating the practice. Be prepared for some turnover. That's going to happen even if you're the world's best boss. Be prepared mentally to have some turnover happen within that practice. All right, structure-wise, there's no perfect way to structure a practice transition. Three main ways to do it, though. There's quick turn. That's you buy it, seller leaves, and it's a fast turnover. It's your show now. It's going to be easier to implement strategic initiatives and changes, but conversely, it could make retaining patients a little bit more difficult. So a solid plan can go a real long way there to make sure those patients are still tied to the practice. Getting a good endorsement from the seller goes a long way. But bank financing, very easy for that type of transition. The opposite would be a slow buy-in. This allows that buyer to kind of grow into the role, be able to be mentored by the seller, and also helps with patient continuity. This is a little bit more like a marriage, so make sure that you understand that relationship. Make sure this is someone that you can work with for a period of time. And then similar, but is the quick term, but the doctor stays on as an associate. So great for a growing practice that still needs some extra capacity because now you have two docs to work there. Make sure, again, that you understand the seller personality. Are they the type that can shut off being the owner and come to terms that it's no longer their practice, be someone who can support your vision as you purchase it? Getting into some more nitty-gritty details, stock versus asset sale is something to be aware of. I won't go too far into it, but there's two ways to purchase a practice. Stock sale is you actually buy the shares of it. This is more likely for one of those buy over time situations. Banks don't like it. Some will actually not even lend unless it's an asset sale. That's where you create a brand new entity and you buy just the assets and the goodwill from the sellers. So this reduces some legal liability, like a malpractice suit can't follow an asset sale. So that's why banks like that. Financing is going to be dictated by the setup goals of both the buyer and the seller. Like I said, bank financing, pretty attainable right now. Going the bank route will definitely simplify the transition. Works great for when the seller isn't staying on or just staying on as an associate. The other would be seller financing, and that's where the seller carries a portion or all of the loan. More common for a buy-in over time or a seller who's trying to reduce tax liability. Most transition loans are going to be 10-year loans, much like a cold start loan. You just don't have that interest only period. As you go through the process, typically you might sign an NDA so that you can look at the financials. Then it would be going to making an offer. So that's often called an LOI or letter of intent. This is a non-legally binding purchase offer. So basically you and the seller are agreeing that you're both going to work towards the goal of making the sale happen, though neither of you are legally bound to do so until you actually sign the next step, which is the purchase agreement, and that's where it truly becomes official. So who do you need to have on your team to help this? An accountant's going to be really helpful to make sure that you understand any tax ramifications. For example, asset deals are better for a buyer as you can accelerate depreciation expense. You're going to want an attorney involved with the purchase agreement, whether or not you have yours write it or you're reviewing one prepared by a seller's attorney. I would say it's probably going to be cheaper for your attorney to review it than it will be to have them write it. But you will want an attorney to help out and make sure that everyone's comfortable with those legal documents. Get a ton of resources out there, from brokers to companies that can take you from start to finish. Some even provide some of that legal documentation, to individual consultants, to resources like Dr. Alliance groups that have someone like me for an office to speak to. All right, so taking over the practice. Make sure you understand the history and do some financial analysis around what has historically been done so you can understand what is what has been done well and where improvements can be made. Much like a cold start, build a plan, go through that process, make sure that this matches your personal, professional goals. It's a really good idea to just go through the entire business plan, financial projection process. Those projections are going to be really critical to make sure that if you're going to make significant changes to the office, that you can do so in a financially fiscal way. Credentialing is something you're going to want to jump on real quick. That can sometimes cause a lag and create delays. I'd recommend finding a billing expert that you can talk through on the best way to work through that transition. That one is definitely outside of my expertise. And then once you are in and running, having KPI tools, so KPIs, key performance indicators, understanding your business metrics are critical. Same point applies to cold starts. Start tracking metrics once you're open, measure your business. This creates the ability to focus your energy on those areas of the practice that really need it and are most vital to running a financially successful practice. There's a few great tools out there. There's two big main ones. I actually use them both in my wife's office. So highly recommend making sure that you manage your numbers and have a program that can help you analyze them. And there's a lot of really smart people in this industry that are willing to help, much like I mentioned with the cold starts, colleagues, groups, consultants. Don't do it yourself. Both either buying a practice or starting a cold start, have a support system around you. It's a little bit like having your own board of directors to help you with high-level strategy. Long-term revenue, it ranges wildly. 5 to 15% is common growth, but again, it very much depends on how well you run the practice. Take home, again, very difficult to just pin down. It's going to depend on if you have associates or not. The most efficient practices are generating 30 to 40% of their revenue, collected revenue, is available to pay themselves, to pay other doctors, to pay debts, and any other extraordinary expenses. So that's that one. We could spend a whole half hour on that. So I apologize for being brief there. But in addition to cash flow that you're able to generate for yourself, you also have a great asset at some point that you can sell in the future as well. All right, lastly, we'll hit on the associate market. So mentioned this a number of times already. High demand, private practice. We're seeing full-time wages. Again, don't hold me to this very strict range, but 110 to 150 is a reasonable average. There's definitely outliers as well on both sides of that. There's three main forms of compensation structure that we're seeing in private practice these days. First would be a flat day rate or salary. That's pretty common. Easy for both owner and associate, provides good stability, but limits your upside potential. The other side of that spectrum would be a production-based. So 15% of collected production is a very common number these days. You can find something a couple percent on either side of that 15, but that would be what I'm seeing most often. Great for a higher end office, high revenue per patient, or someone who's really looking for upside potential. I like also a hybrid of the two, which is more of a base plus bonus model. This could be something like $400 a day in bonuses that take you to an average of 500, but say you can get 600 on the busiest day. Or another way of looking at it is a guaranteed wage with a percentage of production. So you get the greater of the guaranteed or as the percentage of production. All right, as you go through this, make sure that you are interviewing the practice as much as they're interviewing you. Make sure you understand their standards of care. How does this compare to what you practice, what you're looking for? Can you bring a specialty to the clinic, or is there something that they do well that you fit in very well with there? Make sure that it fits into your long-term goals. It could be that you're looking for practice ownership opportunity. Understand, are you going to be looked to drive growth? Or are you taking over existing patients? How does that compensation model line up with your expectations? So if you're on a production model and you're taking over a light schedule, that's not going to work real well. How to find them, like we said before, standard job sites. I hear if you've made it here, you probably know of a site that does job listings with Eyes and Eye Care. You can also, email me your resume, check industry forums, trusted reps. So I want to wrap up by saying that there's a number of avenues to get into private practice. It's a great way to practice. Demand is high for associate ODs. There's ample opportunities with docs approaching retirement who are looking to sell their practice, and cold start optometry is a great way to go as well. And so all of these options can really be worked into a full-time or part-time option. Docs looking for both really becomes practice dependent, and earnings potential is great. And there's plenty of upside, particularly with practice ownership, along with all of the rewards that go with owning your own spot. So I'd like to wrap it up with that and answer any questions that you have. Thank you all for listening. I have one question here that is, what are some financial tips that you have for those just starting out with their own practice? It would be track, right? Go through that process of creating the projections. It's going to help you learn a lot. Expenses are always a little bit higher than you think they're going to be in the first year. There's tons of things that you don't think about, like merchant processing expense that will end up being a few $1,000s a year. But really, at the end of the day, find an advisor, find someone. Like what I do with PECAA is I help doctors review their numbers. So get someone that you can sit down and be forced to explain your business, and have someone who can ask you critical questions about your business. Even just starting by looking at your P&L. So every month, print off your P&L and just start looking at it. Look for trends, look for changes, and try to explain those changes. And over time, you'll become more and more comfortable with what you're seeing. It's not going to all make sense right away, but the more you look at it, the more that'll start to make sense. And like I mentioned, having something like Edge Pro or Glimpse or ABB Analyze, to track metrics is a fantastic tool, and one of the key things that I would look at. Another was, as a newer practitioner, what are signs we should look for looking to purchase a practice? You mentioned as a warm start versus cold start. Do you think there's far greater benefit to doing this starting from the ground up? I think that really depends on what you're looking for, what your goals are, right? If you want new and shiny, everything done your way, go the cold start route. If you're more interested in the actual ownership, business management, getting going, being profitable, the kind of buying a practice warm start, willing to put in a little bit of work and make it your own, without some of the other hassles that come with the cold start, that might go a little further. Creating a marketing plan. Should you hire a marketing firm? You don't necessarily need to. There's plenty of people out there that can do that. Like I have someone on my team who actually does that for our members. So there's some good resources out there where you can at least start that. But there are some good firms that can help. That really, again, just depends on your goals. All right, so those are the questions that I have so far. Thank you all for listening tonight. Hope you have a great rest of the day, and we'll talk soon.